Hollywood gave us a hero's death, a quick, defiant end for the champion of Scotland. We all remember the scene. A blood-streaked Mel Gibson on a scaffold, a crowd silenced by his courage, and one last thunderous cry of freedom. Before the axe falls, it's dramatic, it's inspiring, and it's almost entirely a fantasy. The real story of William Wallace's execution is far darker and more horrifying than any movie would dare to show. In 1305, King Edward I of England, the self-proclaimed Hammer of the Scots, didn't just want William Wallace dead. He wanted to make an example of him. He wanted to annihilate not just the man, but the very idea of rebellion. What happened that day wasn't merely an execution. It was a carefully staged piece of political theater, a performance of cruelty so brutal it was designed to haunt the memory of anyone who saw it. This was a warning etched in blood and bone. So, what really happened in Wallace's final, agonizing hours? The betrayal and capture, the beginning of the end. To understand the end, we have to start 7 years earlier. After a crushing defeat at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, William Wallace, the Guardian of Scotland, became a ghost. He resigned his title and vanished, a wanted man with a price on his head, hunted relentlessly by King Edward's agents. For years, he moved through the shadows of the country he fought to free. While many Scottish nobles were bending the knee to Edward, accepting pardons to save their lands and lives, Wallace refused. He was the one man Edward I would never forgive. His time as a fugitive wasn't just spent hiding. He was actively working for Scotland's cause, traveling to Europe as a diplomat to seek support from King Philip IV of France, and even planning a trip to Rome to plead Scotland's case to the Pope. But his fate would be sealed back on home soil. In the summer of 1305, the hunt intensified. Edward, determined to finally crush Scotland, knew capturing Wallace was the key. He used bribery and coercion, turning Scots against each other. The final betrayal came on the night of August 5th, 1305, at a place called Rob Royston, near Glasgow. A Scottish knight, Sir John de Menteith, who had sworn loyalty to Edward, orchestrated the capture. Some accounts suggest one of Wallace's own servants, a man named Jack Short, may have been the one to give away his location. Tempted by English silver, there was no final, heroic battle. Wallace was taken in the dark, without a fight, perhaps ambushed, or even asleep. The man who had faced down entire English armies was undone by treachery. With his capture, the greatest symbol of Scottish resistance was in the hands of his most hated enemy. The long, agonizing journey to London and to a fate worse than death was about to begin. The long road to London, a journey of humiliation. The nearly 400-mile journey from Dumbarton Castle to London wasn't a simple prisoner transport. It was a victory parade for King Edward. Wallace was treated not as a captured knight, but as a monster on display. His hands were bound, and his legs were tied beneath his horse. A painful and humiliating way to ride for weeks. He was paraded through English towns and villages, a living trophy of Edward's conquest. For the English populace, Wallace was the stuff of nightmares. Propaganda had painted him as a savage who spared neither age nor sex, monk nor none. Now, here he was, bound and helpless, a spectacle for the jeering crowds. His arrival in London on August 22, 1305, was a meticulously staged event. He was paraded through the city streets, where mobs, whipped into a frenzy, pelted him with filth and rotten food. This was a key part of the punishment, to strip away his dignity, to reduce the hero of Scotland to a reviled criminal before his trial even began. This procession was a masterclass in public relations for the English crown, reinforcing the narrative that this was not a political prisoner, but a captured beast. King Edward understood the power of symbols, and he was making sure that by the time Wallace reached his judgment, he would already be condemned in the eyes of the public. The sham trial. Justice as a weapon. The next day, August 23, 1305, William Wallace was taken to Westminster Hall. The Great Hall was a symbol of English justice and royal power, but what unfolded was nothing of the sort. It was a political show trial. There was no jury. Wallace wasn't allowed a lawyer. He was brought before a commission of English nobles to hear the charges and his predetermined sentence. To mock him further, they placed a crown woven from oak leaves on his head, a sarcastic gesture suggesting he was the king of outlaws. The charges were read: murder, arson, and atrocities against English civilians. But the main charge, the one that sealed his fate, was high treason. This was the moment that would define Wallace's legacy. Though not allowed a formal defense, he refused to be silent. When accused of being a traitor to King Edward I, Wallace's voice rang out. He admitted to the acts of war, but he denied the charge of treason. His defense was simple and unshakable. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. He had never sworn an oath of allegiance to the English king. He was a citizen of Scotland, loyal to his rightful king, John Balliol. His argument was sound. But in this court, the truth didn't matter. His defiance was met with fury. The verdict, of course, was guilty. The sentence had been decided long before. For his alleged crimes, he was to be hanged. But for the ultimate crime of treason, the punishment was far more terrible. He was condemned to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most agonizing punishment in English law, reserved for the very worst traitors. The mockery of a trial was over. The true punishment, the public performance of cruelty, was about to begin. The final procession, a theater of cruelty immediately after the sentence. The final act of Wallace's life began. He was taken from Westminster Hall, stripped completely naked, and tied to a hurdle, simple wooden frame, like a fence panel, chained to the back of a horse. He began his final journey. This was a 6-mile procession of agony from the Tower of London to the public execution site at Smithfield. The journey was deliberately slow, designed for maximum public exposure. The streets were lined with crowds in an almost carnival atmosphere, as Londoners turned out to witness the degradation of England's greatest enemy. They screamed insults. They threw rocks, rotten food, and animal filth at his exposed body. He was beaten with sticks and whipped by those who could get close. For 6 miles, he was dragged over the rough, filthy cobblestones of medieval London, his skin torn and his body broken long before the executioner even touched him. This agonizing journey was an integral part of the punishment, slow, public erasure of his humanity. King Edward wasn't just killing a man. He was demonstrating what happens when anyone dares to defy a king. The execution at Smithfield, an anatomy of horror when the horrifying procession finally reached the elms at Smithfield. Wallace was mangled and barely conscious. What followed was the methodical dissection of a living human being, performed before a cheering crowd. The punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was a multi-stage process, each step engineered for maximum pain and terror. First, the hanging. Wallace was hoisted up and hanged by the neck, but not to kill him. The purpose was strangulation, not a broken neck. He was left hanging until he was on the very brink of death, convulsing before being cut down, gasping for air, but still alive. This was crucial to the design. Wallace had to be conscious for what came next. Second, the drawing, which in this context means disembowelment, tied down. The executioner began the mutilation. First, he was emasculated, his genitals cut off and burned in a nearby fire, right before his eyes. This was an act of ultimate symbolic humiliation. Next, the executioner sliced open his abdomen. Then, with Wallace still alive and watching, his intestines and organs were pulled out. Medieval chronicles state his bowels were also thrown into the fire. In the medieval mind, the bowels were seen as the seat of compassion. So to burn them was to symbolically destroy his humanity, while he was forced to witness it. Third, the beheading and quartering. Only after all of this, after he was thoroughly mutilated, did the final stage begin. His head was severed from his body with an axe. Then, the executioner hacked his lifeless torso into 4 separate pieces. The man, who was William Wallace, had been systematically and publicly unmade. A calculated warning. The dismemberment of a martyr. But King Edward's brutal theater wasn't over. The dismemberment of Wallace's body was a calculated political message, a broadcast of terror sent across the kingdom. Wallace's head was taken to London Bridge, dipped in tar to preserve it, and impaled on a spike for all to see. It was a grim and permanent reminder of the price of treason. It would later be joined by the heads of other Scottish patriots who suffered a similar fate. The 4 quarters of his body were sent on a longer journey. Each limb was delivered to a different city as a grisly warning. 1 quarter went to Newcastle, another to Berwick, a third to Stirling, and the 4th to Perth. These locations weren't random. Newcastle and Berwick were key English-held border towns. Stirling was the site of Wallace's greatest victory, and Perth was a major Scottish political center. The message was explicit. A piece of your hero will now hang and rot in the very cities you fought for. This is the fate that awaits anyone who follows his path. The irony of martyrdom. Forging a legend, King Edward I, in his meticulous and savage cruelty, tried to obliterate William Wallace. He wanted to make his death so terrifying that his name would only be whispered in fear. But in this, the powerful English monarch failed spectacularly. The sheer barbarity of the execution didn't crush the Scottish spirit, it ignited it. The story of Wallace's final day, intended as a cautionary tale, instead became the founding myth of a martyr. His horrific death proved to the Scots that no compromise with a king like Edward was possible. Edward had hoped to make an example of Wallace. He succeeded, but not in the way he intended. Wallace's gruesome end became a rallying cry that echoed far louder than his famous victory at Stirling Bridge. Just a year later, in 1306, a nobleman named Robert the Bruce, who had once been a rival to Wallace, raised the standard of rebellion once more, ultimately inspired by Wallace's sacrifice. 14 years after that, Bruce would lead the Scots to a decisive victory at the Battle of Bannockburn, securing the very independence that Wallace had died for. The attempt to physically and historically erase William Wallace is the very reason he became immortal. Edward I's carefully staged theater of horror backfired, transforming a rebel leader into a national legend. By trying to make him a symbol of terror, he accidentally made him an eternal symbol of freedom. If you find these explorations into the darkest chapters of history compelling, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell for more stories from the shadows of the past. And let us know in the comments, do you believe such a brutal punishment was a tool of justice, as King Edward claimed? Or was it purely an act of terror designed to break a nation's spirit? Thanks for watching.